What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another discussion video with Dr. Goku. Today, we will finally be making sense of all of the Dragon Ball timelines, no matter what type of fan you are. To make this video easier to understand, the timeline topic will be a 3-part series. With the first part, we'll be explaining the 4 timelines in Dragon Ball Z. In part 2, we'll explain the 3 new ones of Super. And in part 3, we will examine the entire Dragon Ball universe, which is Dragon Ball Online, Xenoverse, Heroes, and the movies, and we'll see if there are other timelines that can be exploited there. But first, cue the intro. First off, I want to give a big thanks to Anti-Metaman on Twitter for his Kaizenshu post. He did a very detailed explanation of all the factors that piece together of the different timelines. I highly recommend giving this a read. I'm going to put the link of his profile in the video description below so you can check it out. Now let's begin. Welcome to part 1 of the timeline series. We're going to start at the first official illustration of the 4 Dragon Ball Z timelines from the Daizenshu 7. The 4th timeline, or also known as the Unseen Timeline, has been heavily debated, and yet no one has been able to make logical sense of it. But today, I'm going to show and explain to you how the 4th timeline fits in with the other timeline. Now, the original timeline, prior to any time travel, is Future Trunks' story, or Timeline 3. This is the same timeline we saw from the History of Trunks TV special, or the anime episode 164, Ghosts from Tomorrow. So we begin by traveling back to the beginning of Timeline 3. Similar to the anime, Frieza and King Cole arrive on planet Earth at age 764. However, this time, they were killed by Goku and not Future Trunks. 18 months later, at age 766, Goku is infected with the heart virus and dies. 6 months later, on May 12th, age 767, androids 17 and 18 appear. They begin their onslaught by killing all of the Z warriors except for Trunks, Gohan, and Yajirobe. Now 7 years later, in age 784, Bulma was finally done creating the time machine. So now Trunks can go back in time, give Goku the heart medication, and give the Z warriors a fighting chance against the terrible monsters the androids were. So he travels from age 784 of his timeline to age 764 of the past, when Frieza came to Earth. Trunks arrived to this timeline, and it's the same timeline that we follow in Dragon Ball Z, as he was the one that now kills Frieza this time. A few hours pass, and finally Son Goku arrives. Future Trunks gives him the medication for his heart virus. He then explains who he is, where he came from, and why. By Goku having the antidote, this creates the first paradox in time, splitting the timeline into Timeline 3, the original timeline, and Timeline 1, the main timeline. Unfortunately, it takes 1 full year for future Bulma to create enough fuel for the time machine in order for Trunks to travel back to the past again. So now 1 year passes, and it's age 785 when Trunks travels back to the past to age 767. He traveled back so that he can study the androids, find their weakness, and if anything, he would bring back Goku to his future. So Trunks arrived May 12th, age 767 in the past, and as the story goes, both him and Krillin find Dr. Gero's secret lab, and they also find the blueprints to androids 17 and 18. Having these blueprints, Trunks now decides to travel back to his timeline to give the blueprints to Bulma. Bulma is able to use the blueprints to create a shutdown controller similar to the one that the past Bulma created for Krillin, and he was going to use on Android 18, but didn't. With the controller, Trunks was able to defeat the androids in age 786. 2 years later, it's now age 788, and Imperfect Cell finally shows up. But he's unable to find the androids, and so he can't become complete. He ends up finding out that Trunks has a time machine, so he ends up killing him and traveling back to the past to age 763, 1 year before Trunks first arrived in the past. Now, just because Cell traveled to 1 year before Trunks even came to the past, this does not mean that history has been changed yet. There hasn't been a creation of a paradox. The moment that a paradox was created was when Trunks found the photos of his own time machine, and he also found out about Cell's cocoon. By finding the photos of his time machine, this is the event that caused Trunks to stay in the past so that he could train in the hyperbolic time chamber with Vegeta. We know that in the future, Trunks was able to defeat Cell because he trained with Vegeta. So when Cell traveled to the past, he technically wasn't the one who created the paradox because it was based on Trunks finding the photographs. This second paradox has now caused the timeline to be split into Timeline 1 and into Timeline 4, also known as the Unseen Timeline. But the problem with the Unseen Timeline is that in the Daizenshu 7, it states that the Cell games began without Trunks. Now, if we strictly abide to the Daizenshu 7, then there is a Cell games without Trunks. And in order for this to happen, Trunks had to have come back the second time in age 767, find the blueprints for the androids, but leave before seeing the pictures of his old time machine and Cell's cocoon. So this timeline split happened only after Trunks saw the photos and decided not to leave in order to train with Vegeta, but that's what caused the paradox. This also allows for two perfect cells to exist in two timelines. That being Timeline 4, where there's a Cell games but no Trunks, and Timeline 1, where there's the Cell games with Trunks, and everything plays out as we saw in the anime. In Timeline 4, when there is no Trunks, this means that Vegeta never has this enraged rampage moment because of Trunks dying, and Gohan doesn't lose his left arm when trying to save Vegeta. Gohan still ends up defeating Cell, but this time he does it with a two-handed Kamehameha wave. Meanwhile, the rest of history plays out exactly the same, with the Buu Saga happening, Battle of Gods, Resurrection F, the Universe 6 tournament, etc. Now there's one last timeline left to explain. When Trunks came back for the second time, he could have made one of two decisions. He could have decided to stay and train with Vegeta because he noticed that his time machine was in a photo and Cell existed, or he could have chose to leave right after finding the android's blueprints and going back to Bulma and having her create a controller to destroy them. Now, in the latter scenario, this Trunks is once again met by Imperfect Cell in age 788 and is defeated, which allows Cell to travel to the past. While in the former scenario, since he's training with Vegeta in the Room of Spirit and Time, he would have had enough strength to defeat Cell when he were to go back to his future timeline. Thus, this creates a third paradox, which is Timeline number 2, or the New Future Trunks timeline. With that said, it finally brings us to all 4 timelines that were created in Dragon Ball Z. Timeline 1 continues into Dragon Ball Super, as well as Timeline 2. In fact, it is the Trunks from Timeline 2 that comes back again in Dragon Ball Super asking for Goku's and Vegeta's help. So now in part 2 of this series, I'll be covering the timelines that are relevant to Dragon Ball Super, those being Timelines 5, 6, and 7. And I'll also have a link in the description of this video to that one, that way you guys can check it out. Also, I wanted to ask you guys, do you agree with how Timeline 4 or the Unseen Timeline turned out? Does this way seem like the most probable way? Tell me your opinions in the comments below. And if you like my content, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, that way you'll be updated for all future content that I release. But until then, have a great one.